A lot of the agents and workflows that we build are mostly focused around mission critical, multi-step processes that often involve different kinds of personas. So they're not agents for just end-to-end knowledge work that usually starts and ends with a person. They're usually multi-step processes. So think of things like invoice processing, end-to-end invoice processing and correction, or diligence reporting, or different kinds of multi-step monitoring systems.
Most podcasts talk to founders after the story is already written. When the latest trade is announced, the product has shipped, and the narrative is clean.
We wanted to find out why they decided to take the founder leap in the first place, what idea captured their imagination, and how they handle the pressure to build. Welcome to First Commit. I'm Laura Hamilton.
I'm Eliya, and we're investors at Notable Capital. We spend a lot of time with technical founders who are on the cutting edge. If you're thinking about what it's like to start a company in the AI era, this one's for you.
This is First Commit. Let's get into it. Today we are chatting with Maya from Thread AI. Maya is the co-founder and CTO working on AI native orchestration. Welcome, Maya.
It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So you came up through Goldman Sachs and built the digital subscriptions platform at the New York Times before landing at Palantir. It would be great if you could touch on the thread connecting all those experiences and when you knew that you wanted to branch off on your own.
Yeah, so I've spent, I would say, the majority of my career working across various regulated spaces and enterprises. So yeah, when I started my career at Goldman Sachs, I was primarily an infrastructure backend engineer building software for various business divisions and prime brokerage and futures trading. So there was always this emphasis on security and data governance and understanding basically how to build software at scale. And that's been the theme. So even when I went to go work at the New York Times, I spent a good chunk of my career building out their payment systems. And so working directly with auditors and making sure that the infrastructure that we built is PCI-compliant, among other types of compliance. And similarly, the work that we've done at Palantir has been working with not just large government agencies like the defense, but also working with other large enterprises. And that's been the theme, whether we're building AI native software or other kinds of software. I spent a lot of my career working in these regulated spaces. So understanding their needs, and that has really helped shape the experience of how we think about building software at Thread AI. Understanding enterprises from basic principles and building software that fits their needs, as opposed to building a proof of concept and then trying to retrofit enterprise features into it.
Yeah, that's great. We'll definitely get into how you're focusing on AI orchestration and what that means at Thread. But before that, I would love to dive deeper into your work at Palantir. So as you mentioned, you were building infrastructure that ended up in the hands of the DoD, but didn't get the clearance to see your work deployed. I would love to hear more about that story and kind of what that did psychologically to maybe fuel the fire.
It was definitely a very interesting experience. So when I joined Palantir, I was not yet, like you mentioned, a U.S. citizen. There were many cases where I had to build a lot of software, and I oftentimes would not see how it would get deployed in the field. And I think the main thing that has enforced is obviously working in a team with high trust. So I spent a lot of time working with my now co-founder, Angela. At the time, she had the clearance and access to the problems at the edge, and it really helped forge this strong work relationship. But also the main thread here is when you're building software, especially infrastructure, there's certain kinds of reliability guarantees and feature sets that we have to make sure exist so that you can have the peace of mind where knowing regardless of where your software is deployed, it is functioning according to whatever invariance that you've set. So there is certain quality and certain bar that you have to make sure that each feature holds. And it's almost like building like a database. You can't simply assume that people are going to retry certain things or people are going to assume certain DevX or UX, because you have to make sure that the software, however way it is used, it is always acting deterministically, or it is always surfacing the kinds of metrics and enforcing the certain feedback loops where it is behaving the same way, whether it is deployed in low side or deployed on the moon or deployed wherever it is deployed.
Okay, so then when you were at Palantir working with Angela, how did you know that one, she was the right person to work with, and two, that it was time to leave?
We spent a lot of time working together on a lot of different projects. So she's also very technical. Her background is also engineering. And the interesting part is a lot of, I think, our skill sets is a nice Venn diagram, whereas my background has been mostly spent in distributed systems and infrastructure. Her background has been mostly spent in working with data and intelligence systems. So that kind of like gave us the nice complete skill set of the things that you need to be able to build the kinds of software that you want to build across working closely with data and understanding data and working across infrastructure and deploying that in various kinds of modalities. And I think working at Palantir, we've learned a lot. You get access to crazy problems that maybe other software companies would not put engineers at the front line of. Oftentimes, a lot of software companies have many layers of abstractions away where there are the solutions architects and the different operational layers and the different kinds of testing, whereas Palantir, they take bets on very strong autonomous software engineers. And oftentimes you'll find yourself meeting people that normally you wouldn't at any other tech company. And to your question around when did we think it was time to leave, I think that was around spring of 2023. And the market is very exciting. There was a lot of exciting things happening across different kinds of ML and language models. And I think we had a lot of conviction, knowing that we've known how to work together. For us, that was almost more important than sometimes like the specific idea, because like we knew that whatever it is that we built, we know how to make it work. We spent a lot of time building horizontal infrastructure, and I think being excited about working together was almost, I would say, like more important than what idea we had at the time.
Was there anything psychologically or EQ tests that you ran just to ensure the partnership would be what you had in mind?
I think I would say working closely together for over 4 years kind of like gave that. It's very challenging to take these large bets with someone that you've just met, mostly because you will be put in very difficult situations and oftentimes situations that will test your character. So knowing how you work very intimately with someone and making sure that your communication skills line up, whether it is how you surface disagreement or how you resolve conflicts or how knowing which problems and which hills to die on. And as long as I guess like co-founders know how to work that out, I think that is the most important thing. But I think, yeah, a lot of it came, I guess, like for us, we were lucky because we were tried and tested already in previous kind of like lives, and that gave us kind of like the data points. But again, that's not to say that starting a company isn't a completely different beast, but at least you'll have kind of like a lot of the data points already if you've worked with someone that closely and within that capacity, which is different also from, in some cases, folks will think that if they start a company with their friends, they know their friends and nothing really. That's a very...
For sure. And it's very daunting to leave a safe job that you're enjoying and you're still learning a ton, and to start a company with someone, but you don't know what you're starting yet. When you're thinking about brainstorming, how did you seek validation about early proof points that Thread would be what it is today? Or maybe you started with a different idea?
We were fortunate in that I would say we haven't pivoted from when we started. So a lot of the time that we spent at Palantir was mostly building ML ops. So building model training, model inference, model evaluation systems. And we knew that we did not want or could not even build whatever it is that we built at Palantir for various different reasons, but also that was not the space that we wanted to be in. We were very interested in everything that happened downstream of that. So everything downstream of ML ops, because we knew that models will continue to be more ubiquitous, more available. There will be a lot of interesting things. The model will continue to improve. There will always be like model drops every week. But the hypothesis was that enterprises will still have very unique challenges operationalizing these models for different kinds of reasons. And the models cut across infrastructure and the application layer. They now are mixing and matching multimodality, which like in previous worlds, that was almost like completely separate infrastructures. And we've really admired what some of the orchestration companies have done. So around 2023, we knew that companies like Temporal and Conductor have solved for a lot of the durability and core orchestration problems. But at the time, we noticed that they haven't solved for the non-determinism that comes with AI models. So we thought there's a lot of market for in that space. And we were also really inspired by that Toolformer paper that came out of Meta, I think early 2023. But that paper was mostly focused around language models and giving them access to tools. We knew that enterprises were not going to train on specific APIs, but we thought a lot of the ideas behind that paper were very interesting, almost interesting enough for someone to quit their job. And I think that paper was almost like the inception of a lot of what we see right now, things like function calling, tool calling, MCP, and agent. And that's been kind of like that space that's now getting a lot of traction. But we knew basically to be able to do that for a large enterprise and understanding the enterprise ecosystem, which oftentimes has a lot of legacy systems, has a combination of vertical software, has different kinds of like data problems. Being able to build these kinds of agents that meet enterprise guarantees is a very hard problem, and usually hard problems have like decent markets.
And I would love to touch on what types of agents you're building for the enterprise, because I can imagine there's some use cases where you're seeing parallelism between one enterprise and another in similar software, but I can imagine a lot of use cases could be more services heavy. So I'm curious how you balance the services versus software approach at Thread.
We've learned a lot, and again, what works well with the forward deployed, what doesn't work well with the forward deployed model. And for us, when we started, we knew we always wanted to build a product and a platform. But obviously, there is always kind of like some customization that has to happen. But oftentimes, enterprises are also, if you teach them and they are willing to work on these specific customizations. So you can always kind of like sometimes push back on some of these specific bespoke customizations and have the customer own a lot of that. A lot of the agents and workflows that we build are mostly focused around mission critical, multi-step processes that often involve different kinds of personas. So they're not agents for just end-to-end knowledge work that usually starts and ends with a person. They're usually multi-step processes. So think of things like invoice processing, end-to-end invoice processing and correction, or diligence reporting, or different kinds of multi-step monitoring systems, or triaging workflows that involve mechanics in the field. And oftentimes these workflows have data capture, so things from physical systems, and they often will require you to run large workloads asynchronously. And then they'll sometimes require an investment in a human in the loop. So usually a person who has domain expertise. So they're not necessarily the builder, the person who created the workflow. They're not necessarily like that kind of persona, but they oftentimes are the domain experts. So let's say it is an insurance claim processing workflow. They would be the ones who have go or no go and around the outputs of the models. So they basically would stop when the workflow stopped and their feedback is solicited, they would know whether to correct it or to pause it or to reroute it. And then basically a lot of these workflows oftentimes will push out data to the customer's sinks, whether it's their own data lake or like some kind of notification system. And our infrastructure makes it very easy to swap in and out models to create. We've invested a lot in the separation of data and compute, so creating a very interesting context layer. So we handle a lot of the data movement that comes with that, the data entry and eviction, and help enterprises basically connect that to their systems. So oftentimes these workflows are long-running, multi-step, and involve different kinds of personas interacting with them.
Got it. And how do you gain the enterprise's trust? You're now a Series A startup, but previously you were a seed stage startup and you're selling to massive organizations. So what did that take?
It is challenging selling to enterprise. The contracting cycles are very long. We've had cases where some contracts were closed within a week, other cases where it's taken us over 2 years to redline a particular contract. And I think some of it, again, is since we've spent over decades in the space working with enterprises, so building upon kind of like trust that we've demonstrated in these areas in the field. And some of it is also from the beginning, we've really invested in a lot of the security and data governance and like a platform layer investments when some might argue, oh, you've done that before product market fit. So a lot of kind of like every startup I guess, journey is unique, but in some cases, folks will think you have to follow the specific playbook. If you put out an MVP, like that doesn't work anymore. Or what is an MVP is very different for us versus other companies. So for us, we had to be on multi-cloud. So like for some companies, they never even deploy more than one cloud. So we're deployed on all three clouds. We've had to chase a lot of the different compliances, whether the GDPRs, the HIPAA, and like we had to implement regional support, which for a lot of companies, that is a big lift. But if you're an infrastructure company, that is table stakes. So, and I think some of these early investments have paid out. And as opposed to trying to build everything in like one microservice and trying to prove what a simple MVP is, I think people are that no longer hold water.
And you mentioned the FDE model is something that you're leveraging. FDE seems to be the new AI engineer title in the sense of everyone's hiring FDEs right now. What is your definition of an FDE? And have there been any learnings of like what's worked or what hasn't worked?
So we call them, like you said, applied AI. So we have various kinds of, there's applied AI data science, applied AI engineers, and applied AI strategists. And the idea is these folks are engineers or come from strong backgrounds, either across different sciences or other kind of like fields where they've demonstrated a strong track record. But these folks are basically at the edge of the problem. They're not necessarily building the engine that is behind Lemma, but they are building with Lemma, and they have the intimate understanding of the enterprise's APIs and data problems, and they can basically go from very raw customer requirements and draw them onto the platform in a way that still kind of like holds the tension of making sure the customer is set up for success, but also in a way that optimizes for how our platform is built. So they understand basically how the data movement should go or push for which particular kind of like workflow or component or template, or they also understand which models to use when. And it's becoming a very interesting role, especially because now a lot of the different kinds of roles we're seeing now, in some cases, the model outputs are fundamentally better than some people's outputs. And like a lot of different parts of like what we used to call like backend engineering has become a solved problem. But parts of the stack where understanding the messy data, messy customer requirements, or like operating on imperfect information, that is not a solved problem yet, but we'll see kind of like how that shakes out.
How long are the engagements when you typically send like an FDE in to work with a customer?
Again, it depends on the customer readiness. So if you're working with a customer and they are quote unquote AI or data ready, they have their data cleaned and their processes mapped out, that should be very quick. Our platform is self-service, so you can get a tenant set up and running in like a matter of minutes. But if you're working with cases where the landscape kind of like you're helping kind of like shape and organize how the data should be organized, or cases where the customer, maybe some of the existing workflows or legacy systems don't actually have APIs or don't have, or for sometimes for political reasons, like they're working with a number of different vendors and they don't want to give you access to some data. Obviously, some of that is challenging. And like for that, there's different kinds of ways of building out these workflows. So in cases where everything's great, data is ready, APIs are there, it should be like self-service. But cases where you have to work with understanding if like that problem is actually the right problem to solve, and there's a lot of iteration on the data, or for whatever reason, you are not getting access to all the data that you thought you were going to get access to, then it becomes a little bit more challenging and could take up some time.
How have you learned what customers to say no to? In the sense of you're working with pretty risk-averse buyers in financial services, public safety, healthcare, and I can't imagine everyone's a good fit for Lemma, but obviously you want to try to service these potential large ACVs.
So yeah, a lot of the customers that we're mostly prioritizing enterprise use cases, and these tend to have different kind of like a shape of a contract. In cases where a lot of the problems can be solved with simple knowledge work or kind of like the latest and greatest tooling, like, or where it doesn't make sense to deploy this kind of infrastructure, or it could be like an overkill kind of solution. In those cases where we would basically, like either direct the customer to, like, even if it's a competitor, be like, this problem can actually be solved this way. But cases where you actually need the different auditability and data governance and reliability and the control, those are the ones that are best suited for our platform.
And are they typically comparing you all to something they have internally? Then if you look ahead 5-10 years, what does agent orchestration look like?
So I think it's a very exciting and interesting space. And I think we're seeing kind of like a lot of entrants, which usually is good market validation, the only person building a particular kind of a problem. But I think what's very exciting for us is being able to cut across systems that are legacy and put some of these like very powerful building blocks in the hands of a lot of these users. And I think a lot of interesting things are happening now, cutting across the application and the infrastructure layer, and how you seamlessly bring that, surface that up all the way to the end user experience is going to be very interesting. So like things where there's certain things that are completely like you're dealing with like ingress and egress and VPNs and like peering and like a lot of these like networking constraints, but at the same time your end user might not be as familiar with these. So how do you intentionally surface some of these nouns in a way that empowers that end builder without having them know and spend years basically like understanding distributed systems or like networking? And I think it's going to be a lot of fun also combining kind of like seeing how some of the coding tools has disrupted kind of like the software development lifecycle, and how do we bring some of these tools across these different kinds of systems in a way that is still gives you the control and without completely like giving up autonomy. So that's been kind of like a very interesting theme for us, this idea of controlled autonomy. How do we have these workflows, these long-running self-healing workflows that you still have control, you still see what is happening, and you still maintain the kill switches and the guardrails and potentially the cost constraints across them, but still have them run and do work for you without basically destroying your system.
Have you seen anything gone wrong yet when you've been deploying using these autonomous systems, or is it too early?
Basically, the way we've built our infrastructure, our platform, Lemma, is making sure that we continue to maintain these controls around execution and plan generation. Because like oftentimes there are these checks and balances with the kinds of workflows that we build. There's cases where you want your agents to run completely autonomously, or if you've defined kind of like either a cost constraint for them or like certain system boundaries, you could do that. But in many cases, we take a very strong stance around separating the execution from the generation. And I guess like a little bit of implementation detail. So our platform also supports like importing MCP servers, for example, but we take a very glass box approach where you know exactly which tools could be invoked or will be invoked, and you can select and remove like certain tools versus kind of like pulling in an entire server and giving it full control with natural language. You could do that, but oftentimes we will surface what is actually happening because we want to push our users to know what is happening in their system.
That makes sense. I would love to switch gears slightly and chat about hiring and how you've thought about building a team. The AI talent war is real and it's extremely competitive, and you guys have scaled from single to double-digit folks in a very short amount of time. And so I'm curious how you've thought about hiring, specifically building in New York.
So we're very much New York-based company. We've actually made a lot of folks relocate. Very bullish on the New York market and talent. But obviously, as we grow, some of these strong beliefs might change, and we'll think about kind of like what growing across other regions look like. But for us, from the get-go, we try to focus on folks who are very strong at fundamentals, distributed systems fundamentals. There's often cases where we're happy to teach people, quote unquote, the AI or a lot of like the latest and greatest greatest tooling, as long as they have a deep bench in a particular area. Obviously, with different roles. If you're a data scientist, there's specific things for, and if you're a backend or infrastructure engineer, there's other things. But generally, look for folks who take pride in strong ownership. They're very hungry, very excited about the space, and have very strong fundamentals. Our process isn't very different, but there's some cases where we've borrowed from some of the best like tech companies, and some cases where we borrowed from very unique forward deployed kind of like types of thinking and how we evaluate people. So folks need to be able to build things for planet scale, but still be able to hold that tension. If you need to deliver something within a week, you understand what assumptions you're making and you know how to unwind them and turn it into a real product. So folks who are comfortable delivering under very different kinds of circumstances, but they know the depth of what that looks like. And a lot of tech companies now are also fundamentally changing their interview process to account for how software is changing. But again, like a lot of that is you're still looking for folks who want to dig into the details, want to take systems apart, are very strong communicators, and are not scared of owning end-to-end outcomes, even if it touches systems that maybe that is not kind of like their main area of expertise.
This profile seems popular right now amongst a lot of your competitors and some of the big tech companies. So how do you think about winning candidates?
It is kind of like a fun talent war, but a lot of cases where we've won is we have access to a lot of problems that oftentimes it takes an enterprise years to get access to, whether it's working across the US government or some of the largest companies in the world. Oftentimes startups will not have access to these problems. And I think many cases where we've seen kind of like where we've won candidates over others, folks have been motivated by these hard problems that cut across systems and working with like folks who have a very strong track record. So like on the team, we have folks who worked at some of the best, some of the largest companies in the world and built systems like App Engine or Twilio's Workflow Studio Engine, and as well as some of the other folks we work with at Palantir.
How have you thought about stepping into a new managerial leadership role? How have you learned to lead teams and to rally folks around you? And maybe if you've made any mistakes or have any stories to share.
So both Angela and I from Palantir days have had more people leads in addition to being ICs. And I think that is a strong kind of like tenet that we hold. We don't believe in just having middle management. Everyone in the company is a builder. So it doesn't matter that your level of seniority or tenure. Yes, you might be a people lead and in charge of helping growing others, but at the heart of it, you're still a builder. You're still tinkering with systems, whether it's if you're still writing code or prototyping or writing RFCs. We push for folks who continue to have that muscle as opposed to just managing folks. And I think that's kind of like been the model in which we lead people, because people often want to see that you are leading by example, you can step in and they can trust you as a leader. And it's exciting now. We're seeing a lot of people return back to writing and building code with basically a lot of the tooling that's available right now, where some problems may have been now too abstracted away, or like we're seeing like a lot of leadership return to basically building.
What is your role distribution of a building versus managing at this point? And at what point in a company's growth does it tend to shift?
I guess right now, since we're a very flat organization, I would say the majority of the company reports to me and Angela, lopsided, but it'll be kind of like interesting to see how we scale and grow the team that we've built with us. I would say, yeah, we try to still pretty much active. So we had a hackathon last Friday, and basically a lot of us, participated, which is kind of like exciting. And I think being intentional around the time split, I think will be important as we grow. And probably at some point we will not have everyone reporting to us.
Yeah,
but
no, that makes a ton of sense. So the agentic wave, as you know, is moving incredibly fast. I'm curious, where do you think the enterprise infrastructure layer settles? Do you think it's winner take all, or do you think it's a bit more fragmented than that?
I guess there will continue to be room for a lot of different fragmentation. Obviously, there's a lot of folks who have made investments in their different hyperscalers and the tooling within that because the economics kind of like make sense. But there are very much a lot of systems now that are being rebuilt from the ground up. For us, the nice part about our infrastructure is oftentimes like with enterprises, you don't have to blast your stack in order to use or start building safely with AI, which has been kind of like the main nice entry point for us, because telling an enterprise you have to redo your whole stack is sometimes like a non-starter. But there's going to be like an interesting wave right now where there's a lot of folks who think with the coding tools that they can build everything. So there's a little bit an overcorrection of a lot of folks building in-house. And then there's going to be like market correction. It's like almost like the reinvention of SaaS. There are some things people realize, actually, no. I mean, because writing code wasn't that really the hard problem, but like the last 10% is the hardest problem. Putting it in production and knowing that it's going to scale or it's not going to fail at 3 a.m. or under these certain constraints, it's going to recover. That is always kind of like has been the annoying problem. But I think right now there's like a lot of hype and buzz where everyone thinks they can build everything, which is great and exciting. But there's going to be kind of like, I think Q3 or 4 big kind of like collapses or big, large security kind of like problems.
I'm already seeing it.
Yeah. And then the market will naturally correct itself. And I think like, yeah, companies that have demonstrated that they've earned the right to be in the space will continue to be in this space. And then there's going to be a lot of companies that like will shut down.
What are the roles that you're hiring for right now? Any ending thoughts that you have?
We're very excited. I think we've put up now a couple new exciting roles across the business operations side of the house and also the federal side of the house. We've done the hard work of going from 0 to 1 across federal. And now we're looking for folks who are experts and can scale the machine with us. And of course, always looking for strong engineers and across applied AI, across a platform, back end, front end, folks who are excited about the space. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Maya.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
This was great.